This is my favorite experimental track of all time. It is I Am Sitting in a Room by Alvin Lucier. It's an easy song to explain the concept of because Alvin does it in the first minute of the song, quite literally, with
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. I am sitting in a room.
those words are then played back for the next 44 minutes. In a collection of music essays by musicians titled This Woman's Work, there is a fantastic essay centered around noise and experimental music written by Juliana Huxtable. Juliana Huxtable is an authority on experimental and noise music, a creative force through music and other mediums. She's an accomplished DJ, part of an experimental electronic group called Analema, and also in the artist collective House of Ladasha. She's written books, given lectures, created visual art. She's done so much that her essay in This Woman's Work doesn't even merit a footnote on her Wikipedia page. It deserves a footnote on her Wikipedia page, though. Juliana's essay discusses the enigma of noise music, the ways that writing about this type of music often falls short, and is all centered around Linda Chirac's involvement in the late 60s noise music scene. Sonny and Linda Chirac, important noise musicians from the late 60s, were instrumental in jazz's transition into what we call experimental today. What started with free jazz morphed into so-called noise music, and finally broke completely free from preconceived notions into the realm of experimental. However, in her essay, Huxtable explains how the documentation and journalism on Sonny and Linda's landmark album, Black Woman, fell short. In the essay, Huxtable says, "I'm encouraged to think of the many ways one can approach the analysis of music. The formal structures of the music itself, its lyrical and vocal content, the social and cultural conditions of its genesis. This, my textual undertaking, is first and foremost a praise poem. It seeks not to mend, but to nurture the breaks, from language, from musical structure, from decipherability, that Linda and her artistic contemporaries harness in their sonics." In other words, words fail noise and experimental music. To define what exactly makes an experimental track engaging is to clip its wings, mend the breaks, as Juliana says, or take away exactly what makes that type of music special. So if we can't explain what experimental music is, maybe we can talk about why.
Baby, yeah, line, where the line goes. Baby, line goes. Where the eyes go. Baby, yeah, hey, yeah, yeah. Baby, line goes where the eye goes. Where the
Let's begin our attempt at explaining music that defies logic with the elephant in the room. Well, maybe the bull in the room, but we'll get there. In many, many ways, experimental music challenges listeners. As Juliana mentions, experimental music means experimenting and breaking from every aspect of music as we know it, from language, musical structure, decipherability, and so on. As such, there is an inherent challenge with experimental music. There is work for the listener to do to try and perceive the artist's visions. Alvin Lusher challenged listeners by creating literal audio experiments and composing beautiful works with them, while still challenging the listener's ideas of what music was. For example, one of his most famous quote-unquote songs, Music on a Long Thin Wire, involved clamping a wire to tables across a room, and microphones picked up the varying frequencies on the wire through a series of magnets and wooden bridges. What came out was a sound without human intervention, a natural frequency of this long wire. Was this music, or was it pure noise? Another example of artists challenging and breaking from established structures, and in my opinion, a group that should always be part of the discussion when talking about modern experimental music, is Bull of Heaven. Bull of Heaven have released literally millions of songs, almost all of them being less than a second long, but others lasting years. Like this many years. Bull of Heaven obviously aren't a band to play if somebody passes you the aux, but their style of releasing millions of experiments created by algorithms and wizardry pushed not just the barriers on theory and music structure, but the commodity of music itself. The longest Bull of Heaven songs that have been posted to YouTube are sort of their own challenge in their own right. Listeners take them on and are able to come back to the comments with pieces of songs that actually sound good. They're like adventurers that have successfully completed a quest. Unfortunately, it looks like the Bull of Heaven's website, where all the music was posted, has been taken down. It just adds another layer to the challenge of even finding their music in the first place. That's possibly the ultimate challenge with experimental music. In his book, England's Hidden Reverse, discussing the noise and underground music scene in Britain during the 80s and 90s, David Keenan described this type of fringe music as the nighttime to pop's daytime. So fittingly, everything exists in darkness outside of public eye. It was rarely written about, and even less so played on radios, discussed, or properly appreciated. So for a long time, the music was simply obscured.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now.
I remember when I first heard I Am Sitting in a Room, I was not ready to take on the challenge of that song.
And I am going to play it back.
I skipped halfway through after listening to Alvin's speech a few times, and impatient at the thought of sitting in a room myself, listening to this guy go on for almost an hour. So I skipped to the halfway mark of the song. When I did, I heard beauty. It was like I had skipped ahead and robbed myself of the song's meaning. Suddenly, my impatience had become part of the song's performance, and it was like the experience was intended, like Lusher knew that people would skip ahead and see the contrast. It was like the difference of going to a beach every day and then not seeing it for 5 years. The corrosion that was so slow when I first started the song became so apparent when I skipped ahead. I didn't realize it at the time, but what I had just heard in I Am Sitting in a Room was a perfect example of one of experimental music's most important breaks. Why exactly is the concept of language so important to experimental music? Well, I remember in high school I took a photography class, and one of the things that we learned always stuck with me. It was the idea that if there was a person in a photograph, they instantly became the picture's subject. If there were no people, then any animals in the picture became the subject. If there weren't any people or animals, then buildings or man-made items became the subject. Basically, we focus on what we relate to first and foremost. It's human nature to relate to the people in a photograph more than a building. So in music, as soon as a word is spoken, that becomes the main focus of the song. That's why there's an obsession with interpreting lyrics, and sites like Genius exist, but not so much for the interpretation of instrumental songs, because we don't relate as easily to things that aren't spelled out perfectly for us, or where there's room for interpretation. Experimental music exists in that uncomfortable and unrelatable area, and forces the unspoken word to be the focus of the song, both to break from the rules of language, but to also force the listener to figure out the meaning of the songs for themselves. Juliana goes a bit further on this in her essay, saying, "The disciplinary structure of language, which announces its presence at many encounters, is a cancer to any attempt at the command or disavowal of a language. This betrayal, or its risk, is a terror from which the only escape is a different register altogether." So that becomes one of experimental music's key breaks. With I Am Sitting in a Room, that is seen clearer than ever, with Alvin Lucier literally severing himself from language over 44 minutes to escape his stutter.
I am sitting in a room. I am sitting in a room.
To be clear, this is different from what Juliana meant in her essay. In it, she was talking about how the intricacies of language become a barrier for people that are not in the quote-unquote correct gender, race, or national border. But Alvin Lucier's speech impairment presents another example of how language can be just as much of a border, and how music genres like experimental can help break them down. This whole idea carries over to music and music theory as well. The stringent rules of what make music good presents obvious barriers to entry if a musician is going to attempt to follow them all. I'm reminded of the infamous album by the Shags, the family group that has been endlessly ridiculed online because they would not or could not follow those rules.
My pal's name is Football, he always likes to roam. My pal's name is Football.
The music was out of tune, the rhythm wasn't right, the melodies were bland or hard to follow. Everything I just said are rules entirely made up by societal norms. Tuning and melody are rigid expectations. The melodies are based entirely on knowledge of existing pop songs. So true outsider music that happens to have the same melody as the Beatles song simply will not do. Artists also use the experimental genre as a vessel to communicate larger political or societal issues, like Terry Theimlitz, who performed a 29-hour piano piece called Meditation on Wage Labor and the Death of the Album, which aimed to showcase how artists are being wrung dry as in this new age of music creation and media consumption. Or sometimes the artist doesn't even try to communicate anything at all. Take Nurse with Wound, one of the most innovative and influential artists in the world of experimental music, and their album Soliloquy for Lilith. The album consists of unrecognizable drones and hums created from a mess of experimental equipment in Stephen Stapleton's studio. It was essentially born from recording electrical malfunctions with little input from Stapleton himself, aside from a few light movements of his hand here and there to enhance the noise. What's left is a strange sort of nothing. No language, no deeper meaning, no melody or rhythm. This is what is left after the music is separated from every known normality of music. The listener is left with a sonic landscape that is as arresting as it is unreadable. It's a perfect example of how experimental music can create a void for the listener to stare into and force themselves to consider the meaning of. What does it even mean to be able to create or hear this noise? And with that, we've reached the third and final why of experimental music, and it's the most important one yet.
This is moon music. In the light of the moon.
Experimental music is the nighttime music to pop's daytime in more ways than one, and perhaps the most direct way is in its unflinching approach to presenting the darkness of the world. Coil literally named their 1999 album Music to Play in the Dark in response to founder John Balance's fear of the dark as a child. However, like those broken toys from Toy Story, the music itself isn't as dark as you'd think, but rather it can be optimistic and hopeful. Balance explained the logic for Music to Play in the Dark in England's Hidden Reverse. When I was young, I was really quite scared of the dark. I turned around and said, I'm going to go out into the woods at night, and if I die, I die. When he thankfully did not die, he said to himself, I now know that fear of the dark is wrong. In fact, it's comforting. That metaphor carries across to much of experimental music. That once the artist and the listener are able to confront what frightens them, they can reach an understanding and appreciation of it at a level deeper than if it had just been ignored. Listen again to Linda Chirac as she sings on Black Woman. Listen to the pain in her voice as she speaks to and on behalf of some of the most wronged and hurt people in history. Again, without using her words, because words simply do not exist to translate her pain. She gives a voice to the millions that must scream but have no mouth. Her voice becomes the light that shines on its darkest points, breaking from our strict and ignorant rules to do so. That ultimately is why experimental music exists. It is not darkness, it shines a light on the darkness of the world, and like Balance did as a child, it explores the darkness without fear. Bowl of Heaven explored the idea of the infinite, with sprawling Mandelbrats of sound too long for any one person to listen to in their lifetime. Alvin Lusher explored the existence of sound itself, with songs so literal and inherently non-musical that he forced listeners to challenge their ideas of what music even is. Coyle explained the dark woods of music, showing that even at its darkest, there can still be beauty, and no matter what, it won't kill you for exploring it. And most importantly, artists like Linda Chirac use their music to explore the pain and suffering in the world, her voice a seismograph, shaking and growing with the power of her ancestry. And now, the music exists in the world for us to explore for ourselves. Be warned, none of this is sugar-coated for the listener. Everyone has to face their fears on their own if they want to wander out into the dark woods of experimental music. If it were easy, then it wouldn't be a lesson worth learning. The artists made this music knowing full well that it would never be played on a radio. There was little chance that a reviewer would even write about their music, let alone get it. And ultimately, it would only be heard by a very select few. But they still made it. the meaning of the music was that important to them. That's why experimental music is.